All good? Okay. Time starts now. So I'm going to quickly start top of case, go into our three contentions, and just kind of explain everything as time permits. So let's start top of case. We strongly affirm the motion that this House believes developing countries should actively decrease the formation of primate cities. So what exactly does this mean? We'll get into it, but first we're going to start with what we frame this debate as. We believe that this should be a value round because the prescriptor believes, means that this should be a value round. Although there's a should, we tell you that there's no actual actionable thing happening here, and that since it says this House believes, it should be a value round because you're looking at the underlying principle of what the House believes or does not believe. And so it's not a fact round because there's no preponderance of evidence, nothing like that. So that is why we tell you this should be a value round, and within that, we tell you that the value criterion should be maximizing equitable development to help the most amount of people. That's our value criterion. I'll say it one more time. Maximizing equitable development to help the most amount of people. So we're going to go over some quick definitions as the government side. First, we define a primate city as a disproportionately large city that dominates a country's economy, politics, and culture. And then we have some examples that were also provided in the info slide, including Jakarta, Bangkok, Cairo, Lima, and Lagos. And then we're going to define actively discourage as sort of just not necessarily paying attention, not promoting the development of these types of countries, instead looking more to stuff like secondary nations and stuff like that.
We'll continue with that. Yeah. How are you actively discouraging something? Do you pause time as a POI?
POI, sorry. Yeah.
How are you actively discouraging something if you're not taking active steps to do it instead of just like sitting passively like you're suggesting? Active discouragement is.
We're talking about simply promoting secondary cities, regional infrastructure, and adjusting like internal migration incentives. But we're talking about the belief of whether this should or should not be happening. So once again, the belief of, therefore making it a value, not necessarily the action of. Do you follow POI or?
Sure, I mean, but you do believe that you should do this action. That's the belief.
The belief.
The belief in the action.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll clarify that as need be, but yeah, I'm going to continue from there. So I want to emphasize this is about developing countries. So when we talk about primate cities, we are looking specifically within developing countries, not developed and such. So who uniquely lack, and countries that will completely suffer as such. I'll clarify this also as time goes on. But let's get to our very first contention: the fact that primate cities drive extreme inequality between urban and rural regions. So what exactly does this mean? When one city becomes the sole economic and political hub for that nation, when there are a primate city by definition, it attracts major jobs, services, and infrastructure investment, as I'm sure our opponents will tell you. However, we tell you that this is actually not good because it leaves rural areas and secondary cities completely underfunded. It leaves them underdeveloped and underrepresented. So we even see this with multiple examples as provided in the info slide, looking at Jakarta. Over 55% of Indonesia's GDP comes from Java Island, while outer islands like the Cali and Papua suffer from chronic poverty. I apologize if I mispronounce any island names here, but the fact is 55% of Indonesia's GDP is reliant on Jakarta, while everywhere else is suffering and in poverty because of the fact that these primate cities are being actively encouraged, and that is why we tell you they should be discouraged. Let's look at another example, Nigeria. Lagos alone dominates economic opportunity, leaving northern regions with 3 times the poverty rate. 3 times the poverty rate, judges, just because of this primate city. And then in Thailand, nearly half of the national population migrates towards Bangkok, another primate city, draining smaller provinces of young labor and education that they need to be able to thrive as a city themselves. They're not able to continue and be cities because of the fact that these primate cities exist. It's like sucking up all the resources, like a wormhole or a black hole, judges. And why does this exactly matter? Because when we have this concentrated growth that's being perpetuated and promoted by the House, you see class divides that continue to grow. You see forced mass internal migration that's unstable, that's not good for anyone, not the country as a whole, not the people living within, and it leaves most of the population behind, suffering, as we said, from poverty.
Point of information.
Yeah.
If you don't have if you don't have a primate city, where are international partners going to trade? Certainly not the agricultural villages, right?
we still have countries and secondary areas. We're saying we're not also getting rid of any primate cities, we're simply saying that we should not be encouraging them. So there's a very big difference between banning any type of primate cities and saying that they shouldn't exist altogether versus encouraging and discouraging them. We're not saying that they should never exist, we're just saying that this encouragement of them should be looked down upon, therefore discouraging them. I'll also expand on that in my second contention, where we talk about how these primate cities undermine national resilience and identity as a whole. So when we have these primate cities, it's like having a single point of failure. When there's something like a natural disaster or an economic disruption, the entire country now suffers because they're reliant on this single primate city. Let's look to 2011. There was flooding in Bangkok, which accounts for over 40% of Thailand's economy, and this caused a 7.7 national GDP loss just because of flooding in Bangkok. Judges, the entire country suffered because of one city. And Jakarta is sinking right now because of overpopulation, because of the fact that so many people are living there, because it's a primate city, and now they're having to employ a $35 billion project to move capital to another city due to how much unstable over-reliance there is. This is not good for anyone, because it causes instability just overall. Even with Lima, the fact that majority, 1/3 of the Peruvian population is living in an earthquake-prone valley. Judges, the fact that this is a primate city has promoted so many people to move there, and now all of these people, if there's an earthquake, they're at a much higher risk of being hurt, of dying, of getting in a conflict. And then we move on to our third contention, the fact that these under-democratic political imbalances are perpetuated by these primate cities. So in developing countries where democratic institutions are young or unstable, centralizing governance in one city leads to disproportionate political influence and elite capture. Let's look at what this means. In Egypt, all national decisions are made in Cairo because that's their primate city. This means that marginalized regions like Upper Egypt and Sinai don't have any say. In Peru, political unrest in 2020 to 2022 was crazy and driven strictly by rural Peruvians who felt that they were heavily ignored by Lima-based elites because it was all happening in these primate cities. Same thing occurs in Nigeria, where we see dominance of Lagos in the media, policy, and power, sparking repeated calls for federal restructuring from other states. Other states themselves are not happy about this. The country themselves does not want it, and therefore we strongly urge vote for the government today. Thank you.
Awesome. If you're filling a paper, the order of this is going to be a little top case, and then just 2 contentions out of all, and go in the order in which it was read. Okay. Lovely. I'm going to get a sip of water and then get started. So there's one. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna get started now. Really quickly, I just want to go through the Gov topic case in which they tell you it's like a value round. The value criterion is we're basically talking about like maximizing everyone's benefit in the country. Okay. Now on to the definition of actively discourage. They say they're just promoting secondary cities. I want to say that this is extra topical. Like, the motion is not this house would develop secondary cities. This house would actively, or like, this house believes that developing countries should actively discourage the development of other cities. We think that because like you can both encourage secondary cities and also encourage promoting primary cities, this isn't necessarily topical. They're not like really affirming the resolution here. So we think that they necessarily have to defend a world in which they are actively discouraging primary city development and trying to move resources away from their primary city. Okay, primate city. With that, let's get into what we think the alternative to discouraging primary cities is, which is to say, like, what is the opposition advocating for? We think that the alternative, quite simply, is just instead of discouraging primary cities, we should create the best possible condition to facilitate the development of these primary cities. It's the exact opposite of discouraging, we're encouraging primary cities, such as like pouring money into universities, education systems, public transit, jobs, etc. And developing these primate cities to the best degree we possibly can. With that, I'm going to be getting into 2 contentions out of opposition. The first contention is simply on economic development and development of the country as a whole. Firstly, for some uniqueness, 2 points. First, as a developing nation, we think that your education system probably isn't great, right? Like, I think that it's pretty clear that if you live in like rural Indonesia or rural Nigeria, you don't have access to the same quality of education that you were going to have access to in like Jakarta or in Lagos. Similarly, we think that you also lack really good economic opportunities in these really rural areas. Now, what do we think happens in the world of the opposition in which you are actively promoting primary cities? We think that you get more investment in the education systems of these primary cities, which means in the effort of making them an intellectual hegemon. Similarly, we think you get more jobs in these primary cities through three mechanisms. The first being construction. If you're actively investing, you're probably building new things, you probably get construction jobs. Second, business. If you actively try to develop the place, then you're probably going to attract businesses, meaning there are more jobs in that area. And then three, we think that it's easier to target foreign direct investment to like one city, to one primary city, rather than it is to have secondary cities, meaning that your country on net is getting more foreign direct investment coming in, which is creating more jobs. And then secondly, we think it is also just generally easier to access these things in a primary city because you have things like social services and transit that you probably aren't getting in like rural villages. Now, why does this argument actually matter? Because we think that the development of things like human capital, which is to say like education, and as well as creating jobs and increasing production are prerequisites to developing the rest of your country. Right? This is a very simple thing in economics. Let me get through my thought. Where it is often seen that human capital or lack of developed human capital is a barrier to growth, is a barrier to development because you can't move past a certain point. Yeah.
So you want to actively harm rural regions because they're not going to get any of these resources if you're directing all of it to these primate cities, right?
Two responses. One, that's really a straw man of my argument. But second of all, what I'm going to tell you, and as I was about to get into in my case, I want to ask you a question, and that question is, I'm going to hand you $1 million. Are you going to have more of an impact if you pour it into like one region trying to do one thing, or if you give like every single region like $1? We think that the impact of your dollar is severe, like, you know, the money, your resources is severely mitigated if you're spreading it out evenly to everyone. And so what I'm getting at with this argument that you prerequisite development by having a primary city is that when you are able to innovate and you're able to better your human capital through pouring the resources that you have right now, which you're a developing nation, they're pretty finite, you then later on give yourself the ability to build out your economy and begin to invest more in like these cities later. But because right now you are still a developing nation, you still don't have like a ton of resources, we don't think that it is possible to invest heavily in these other regions because like you don't have infinite money. But also, that even if you were to try to evenly invest in these other regions, that the impact would be super small, whereas comparatively, if you're pouring a lot of resources into like one place, you are able to actively build out a good education system, and you are able to actually economically develop. This is going to prerequisite basically all of government's case. Okay, next I want to talk about international influence, my second contention. So when other countries can easily access necessary resources in a single geographic location, they're going to work more with you to develop this nation. This is going to be, yeah.
Can you just restate the tagline for this contention?
Yeah, international influence.
Thank you.
Correct. I'm going to start my time. Yeah. We think this results in a few things. First, we think you get more desired tourism. So when all desired flights are to a single location, like if there's one location that people are generally going in one country, then this means that there's more demand for like flights to this city, which means that the airline is going to lower the price. Like it seems counterintuitive, but basically airlines have to have high prices on flights that they don't get a lot of seats on so that they can cover their like running costs. And when they can ensure they'll have a full flight, they can lower the prices. They're just going to increase the demand, which is going to just bring more tourists to the country, which is going to mean they're spending more money in your economy. You're going to get an economic boost. Second, on international trade, we think it gets a lot easier. All trade can happen in one single port, and like companies only have to comply with the regulations of one city, only be familiar with regulations of one city, and they can make solid business connections in one city, meaning you just get more foreign investment and trade in a world in which you have a primary city. Then, or primate city, I keep misspeaking. Then, primate cities in developing countries are the only place with living standards that are the same as developed countries, which means you attract expats to live there, boosting the economy further, as expats are probably more wealthy than your average person in that country, meaning you're making money on their taxes and also just their participation in your economy. With that, I'm going to get into the Gov case. First, on their contention about driving inequality. I think they create a false dichotomy here, where basically they tell you that it's either like investing in primary cities or pouring a bunch of resources into rural areas. What I'm telling you is that as a developing nation, you don't have the resources for rural areas. at least not to an extent that will actually make a significant change. We think that comparatively, it is always going to be better to have a city in which you can go to like not experience poverty and to escape poverty at the point at which you cannot solve for poverty in the world of government. They may give you a bunch of warrants on how bad it is like for rural areas. I'm saying, like, I'm not going to deny that, but I'm saying that the government isn't solving for those rural areas, so we think that it's good to have an area where you can escape that poverty. Then they talk all about like concentrated growth and forced migration. I think that like in a vacuum, sure, these are bad, but in the context of this round where the like dichotomy isn't between having a primary city and having equitable development everywhere, but rather it's you have a set amount of resources. Do I pour them into my primary city, or do I give each little area a teeny tiny amount of money? We think it's always going to be better to have concentrated growth because you're getting that from more education and opportunity. And if it's between having education and opportunity and not having education and opportunity, you're always going to be voting opposition. Then they talk about how we undermine national resilience because there's a single point of failure. Again, it's not having a single point of failure versus having a really evenly developed country. It's having a single point of failure versus having no points of failure because you have no points of like pride, you have no like places in which you have a lot of resources. It is always going to be better to have a place in which you have a lot of resources that could be taken out by a natural disaster than it is going to be to have nowhere where you have a lot of resources. Thus, this actually turns to our side. Finally, on centralizing governance, again, we see that centralized governments, capitals exist in every city on Earth. This isn't a unique argument.
You guys still have a few more seconds, sorry.
No, okay.
Oh, computer.
Sorry, I'm just getting all my papers.
Let's see. You're blind, right?
Okay, here's
Okay. So for a very quick option roadmap, I'm going to start by discussing at the top of the case in terms of like the contention we've been having. Then I'm going to go on to their contentions and provide some refutations. And finally, I will do some rebuilds for our own points based on their responses. And so if everyone is ready, I will start my time from right now. All right, so first on this sort of top of the case, right, we get a contention about like the motion itself and what it's saying. And so what we really want to emphasize here is that this motion doesn't state this house should end the development of private cities. It says this house believes that developing cities should actively discourage the formation of primate cities. So what we're doing in this round is that we're debating a preference. Do we want to actively discourage them or should we not want to? And what that inherently implies is that this is a value round. And so when we're considering the actual impacts of this round, when we consider what we would want to prefer, we tell you that when we are actually going to be actively discouraging primate cities, we can still access all of the impacts in this round. Because what we're doing is we're debating a preference. And so this is not a policy motion where there are actionable impacts or steps being taken. Rather, we're debating a preference. And what we do when we debate a preference is we compare worlds. In a world where we actively discourage, would we have more benefits than compared to a world where we don't actively discourage? And so now that we've sort of established what this motion is really about, let's go into like this sort of response that they have about the fact that we can't be talking about secondary cities, right? Because what we've seen is that a country, of course, has limited resources. And so as our opponents state multiple times in this round, they state that we want to direct all these resources to the primate cities to ensure that we can have economic growth, we can have infrastructure. But what happens when you don't actually direct all of that funding to the primate cities, it is a logical conclusion that resources will be diverted elsewhere. And where we've seen this happen multiple times is secondary cities. They're put into other cities to make sure that we can also help them build up sustainably. And I can even give you examples of this as I will continue to do throughout this round. I'm going to be talking more about this in some refutations. And so keep that in the back of your mind as you're considering the rest of the round. So now let's go on to their first contention, right? Their first contention is about economic development, and they basically tell you how like a lot of developing countries, they're struggling with education, they don't get economic opportunities, but with primate cities we can get more investment. Now, I have a couple of responses to this point. We totally agree that developing countries are definitely struggling, right? Like they don't have that much access to education, but what happens is that when we have primate cities, what we actively continuously do is we direct most, if not all of our resources to to that one city. And so what does that mean? Again, as my first speaker talked to you about, it creates black holes. Basically, we have the entire rest of the country, all of these other regions, which are predominantly rural because those regions just don't get the attention that they need. And every single other area doesn't get access to any of the education. They don't get access to any of the economic opportunities. They don't get access to any of the infrastructure. And so what happens when that occurs, right? What happens when these other regions aren't able to get all of those resources? What happens is that a lot of these rural communities, they will try to migrate. They will try to go to the primate city. And so this is something else that we really need to consider in this round, because what happens when we have the entire country trying to migrate to a primate city so that they can get and build a better economic future for themselves and their families? We see overpopulation. We see that the infrastructure cannot actually sustain these populations. And so what does that mean? It means that these cities that are designed to be economic hubs end up crumbling because they cannot support the large amount of populations that actually go into these regions and expand all these resources. There are not even enough jobs for these people anymore because they're all migrating to that one place. And what does that mean? All of the other regions, not only do they suffer, but now this one region, this one primate city that is connected to basically the entire country's GDP. Again, my first speaker told you about that example. 53% of GDP of Indonesia is in Jakarta. But what happens when that city eventually falls because they can't support that huge population? The entire country, yes.
Don't they need to feed this population? And doesn't that food have to come from farms in rural areas creating jobs?
So the fact of the matter is that when farms and all these other rural regions, in fact, that actually goes to support our own point. If these rural regions are so important for farming and getting all of these resources for these people, and they don't get any funding, and we solely focus on primate cities, how are we getting that food? In fact, that's one of the reasons why primate cities are collapsing, because they don't have the resources to even sustain these large populations that are all migrating to the same exact region. How much infrastructure can one city build when we have millions of people all trembling into the same city in order to migrate because they believe that they can get economic opportunities? We have seen this time and time again in American history. We saw this during the Industrial Revolution. We saw how low-income communities, black communities, marginalized communities, they would travel into these newer cities that were developing, but they were still left in the same conditions. They were left in the slums of the cities because they were not able to grow. So what we tell you is, I'll take it in a bit if I have some time. So what this tells you, judges, is that not only are we leaving other regions desolate and we're basically destroying any chance that they have for growth, but also these primary cities which are connected to the entire country's growth will crumble. And what does that mean? The whole country crumbles too. And so now that we sort of established this entire line of reasoning, let's go on to their next point. They sort of talk about the fact that it allows for all the investment to go into one specific region, right? They say we're going to be able to direct all the investment, it's much more easier. Now, what we would argue is that it's actually a lot more cost effective long term when we don't simply focus on just pouring all of the money into one region, because now that we've again established that we will see these cities eventually crumble, we have to look to the fact that we need to ensure that other regions at least have enough resources to sustain themselves. Because right now, as my first speaker told you, we have regions where they are suffering by poverty rates 3 times higher than any other nation in the entire world. And so what does that mean? That tells you that we have to make sure that we are at least helping people get out of this poverty, because the other side is doing nothing to help them. Those people get stuck in an endless cycle of poverty that they will never be able to get out of. And that is one of the largest impacts in this round, because that means that we are having generational poverty that will continue on for generations and harm these families forever. And so what have we proved to you now by the end of this, through this, right? We've told you that not only are we basically wiping clean all the opportunities in rural regions, we're also making it so primate cities are no longer these economic hubs that they're supposed to be. Okay, and so now let's go on to the next contention that they bring up. They talk about international influence, right? They talk about how we would want to have desired tourism to one area. But the fact of the matter is that tourism doesn't actually always work this way. And so in order to prove this point, I want to talk about Rwanda, okay? And so what Rwanda did is that they are a firm believer against primate cities. Instead, what Rwanda did, and this is again a very logical explanation of what actually ends up happening, is that they decided to invest in secondary cities rather than one primate city. And I don't think our opponents have actually come into this round and provided you any other example of how these funds can be redirected outside of just the primate cities. They tell you we can invest in more education. That's what's already happening. They're doing that in the primate cities already. So they're not redirecting funds. They're basically just stating what's happening in the status quo. But what we tell you that when these funds are redirected, they will go to secondary cities. They're going to invest somewhere, right? And so what happened in Rwanda is that when they invested in 6 secondary cities, like Musanze, again, apologies if I didn't say that right, and Hai, they were able to attract businesses, reduce the pollution that was happening because of decreased population sizes, right? Instead of spreading like everyone into one place, they were able to make it larger and have more people in different areas. And they also allowed for greater tourism for the local economies in each of these areas rather than having like one specific economy. Like my points talk about all these rural areas. How are they supposed to support any sort of local economies right now if we are not actively discouraging the growth of primate cities in the first place? And so that's what we really need to consider in this round. Like this, all of their points about how they're like supposedly bringing these people together, that's not actually what's happening. Because if you think about it logically, when you bring everyone together into one city, when you overpopulate it, you are not going to see those benefits. We can see this in any city today that is overpopulated. You see these harmful impacts, and that is why in the end, I strongly urge a vote for the government side of this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Order will be topic case. I think clarification is necessary, and then I will go case of government, case of opposition. No questions. I will begin now. Firstly, I'm very sad that Primate Cities is not about Planet of the Apes. That would have been a very great motion for this round. But moving into the topic case. All right, so let's just clarify this. I think there's been a lot of confusion, a lot of jargon thrown around, like value, this, that. So what is this debate actually about? Let's make it super clear, right? What opposition is advocating for is encouraging the creation of primary cities. That is to say, these developing countries might not necessarily have these cities yet. We want to develop them. What our government is saying is we don't want these primary cities to be formed. We are against them being developed. We do not want primate cities. That is the advocacy for each side in this debate. I think that should be pretty clear, and the framers' intents. So what does this make of this point from side government? They say we should pour resources into secondary cities instead. Now, I'd say that this is extra topical, first of all. I would say that the motion nowhere implies that we are spending these resources on secondary cities. And just consider that primate cities might not necessarily exist yet, so it's not like we're rediverting resources into secondary cities. The ranking system doesn't exist because we don't necessarily have a primate city yet. We need to create one first before we can divert resources to quote-unquote secondary cities. There's no ranking if we don't have a primate city. But we'd also say that just taking away resources from what is potentially a primate city weakens this potential hub of international trade and international relations, and that's going to be very key in this round because what's important to a country is its interactions with the globe. And when you set up a centralized location, you can make much more change, much more relationships, and much more connections than you can in a diaspora of various transaction locations. I'll take it in a moment. All right. Yes.
What happens to international relations if a primate city basically collapses?
All right, so I think this point about collapsing primate cities is kind of straw man. I would ask you to point to any example of a city that's just collapsed. I mean, has New York just collapsed? Maybe Rome in ancient times was a collapsed primate city. But the fact is these cities, and I'm getting to this later, they're just too big to fail, right? Once you get economically successful, once they're booming, once there's a large population, the government shores it up, right, keeps it stable, and international partners keep these cities stable. And that's going to be unique because international partner buy-in makes these cities more stable than the alternative when there's not as much international partner buy-in. All right, so on this point here about, so I'm going into the government's case now. So the government had three arguments, one about political imbalances. So basically, they're saying that there's a problem with centralized governance, and I think this is actually really interesting. So a question in this debate is now, is centralizing governance in a single area good or bad? Now consider the situation in developing countries. I think we can all agree that a lot of corruption happens in developing countries. And what is the best way to minimize corruption? Well, I think the best way to minimize corruption is oversight. You have watchdog groups internally and externally, external countries, the United Nations, looking to the government to make sure it's doing a good job and using its funds well. So what leads to the best oversight? Is it a single city with most of the government's apparatuses where most economic transactions are taking place? Or is it a variety of cities and settlements where there are multiple local governments, all with their own ordinances? What allows for the best oversight? Because watchdog groups have limited resources. And we would say that the best oversight happens when there's a single thing to look at. If everyone's watching the central government in the primate city where most economic transactions are happening, we minimize corruption. Because everyone can just watch this single point and doesn't have to look around at all the different cities, all the different governments that are potentially engaging in massive corruption. And this is going to be a huge impact in the round because one of the yes, sure.
Wait, so are you saying that like these other cities will have to like develop their own governments? Is that the point that you were making here?
So I think that all cities have their own governments. It's not a question of developing governments. Like there are local governments in every single city. The point is you empower these local governments that are going to be corrupt.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so yeah, like any government's going to be corrupt, but we allow more parties, more watchdogs to watch this single, more powerful government versus governments across the country. Now, why is this the most important point in the debate? It's the most important point in the debate because the largest blockade to the development of the developing country is corruption. You have oligarchs, you have people in government misusing funds, cutting deals that aren't advantageous to the country, but only advantageous to themselves. When you have varieties of local governments, they are not receiving the same media attention that a more powerful central government is, which means that millions, if not billions of dollars can be misallocated on corruption, buying oligarchs' private jets, or it could just be spent inefficiently by people that don't know what they're doing. Compare a primate city, all the best experts, all the best government, all the oversight. This is how we're going to spend the money best. Let's give resources to those who will spend it best and those we can best watch to ensure they're spending it correctly. On the second argument from this government about inequality, we would like to say broadly, you cannot have economic development without capital first. Chronic poverty is a problem, but do not blame it all on private cities as the government would have you believe. These are developing countries. Chronic poverty is going to be a problem. Primate cities are the solution, not the problem.
POI.
Because I'll take a moment. Because what primate cities allow is for jobs to be exported to the countryside. I brought up in my POI the fact that we need to feed these large primate cities. Where do those jobs go? They go to the agricultural areas, rural areas. We need raw materials to build these cities. Where does that come from? Mines. It fuels the creation of towns that are meant to extract local resources. It does trickle down to support the rest of the economy. I'll take your POI.
So you would agree that primate cities will end up using a lot of the country's resources, leaving less for these secondary cities?
No, not less. They get money in exchange, right? It's a trade, right? Because these local towns have resources, they have no way to refine them, no way to turn them into advanced products. It's a transaction. The primate city can make finished products, export it to the rest of the country. It's a beneficial relationship. Without this primate city, there is no place where you can get international help, expertise, supplies, products to refine these natural resources and spread the wealth across the country. There's no good spot. Sorry, I'm not taking any more POIs, I'm taking a lot. Okay, finally, on this point of inequality, on the education and opportunity point, you cannot have good education if you cannot have a very definite city that international educators and academia can take part in. You need a city where professionals can fly in from across the globe, know they're going to be able to enjoy a reasonable standard of living, and spread their wisdom. And about the education point, people can travel to the city, become educated, and return to their local areas. I think this is a very common phenomenon. Even in America, people will go to college at like Harvard, but then go back to their small towns and benefit those. I think it's very intuitive that we can spread education across the country, and we can only enhance education when we have a single focal point for all the best minds to come together and share their ideas. That's how things get done. The marketplace of ideas needs to be bigger. Finally, on this point of undermining national resistance, basically, they say that it's failure. This is the point about like cities collapsing. We say not going to collapse. Cross-apply what I told you about too big to fail and how all the resources of international in the country will be focused on keeping this country, this city, strong. All right. On to the government's case, the opposition's case. We had 2 points. The first point was about development. The fact is, we need international buy-in. We need resources, or we cannot develop. Remember, this country might not necessarily have a primate city yet. So where do other countries go when they want to do business with this country? I mean, they could go to random cities, but that's not as productive. The things they need are there, and it's much more tedious for them to build relationships across multiple urban areas as opposed to a single urban area. Sadly, a lot of business is based on convenience, and maximizing convenience is the only way to get international partners to work with us. So we get more development, we get more academia, the economy expands, agriculture and raw materials are stronger, and as to this point,
Thus, I oppose.
I apologize if there's a bit of page shuffling in this speech. I'll be hopping around a little bit, as you can probably tell by my papers, but I'll try to keep it pretty clean. I'm going to start at top of case and then just kind of hop around from there, so if you guys at any point need a POC, feel free. I'm going to start my 5-minute timer now. So both sides agree on the framing of this debate. We both agree on this being, I guess, a value rounder, as we said, and then we agree on the definition of primate cities. Then we move on to actively discouraging, where we see a bit of conflicting views. We tell you that they claim that we are directly saying that we need to promote secondary cities. I want to clear this up, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, as an inherent effect of not encouraging these primate cities, you see that you're able to have more secondary cities. We are not saying as the government we're going to go in and promote more secondary cities. If that was ever intended, that was a mistake on our part. That's not what we meant to say. We meant to say is that inherently when you discourage something, it means that there's going to be less of an overabundance of it, meaning that other types of cities are going to spark up in place, aka those type of secondary cities that can actually thrive, unlike right now, which we explained. We talked about 3 times the poverty levels in surrounding cities around the primate cities. So just the fact that when we are not actively encouraging these primate cities, we're just going to be able to see better secondary cities, and I'll also get into the logic behind that. But I would like to point out that there was no direct refutation to the poverty levels that we gave you, the 3 times poverty, the actual examples that we gave you from the info slide, but let me continue from there. So they talk about the fact, they really emphasize the fact that one city is better than none. They really talk about the basis that one big area is better than none because they rely on the fact that the alternative of not having a primate city means that there's no other cities, no other resources out there. Judges, we tell you that this is not true. We tell you that it's like having 5 cookies and there's 5 kids. Giving all 5 cookies to one kid versus 1 cookie to each kid. We tell you that by the definition that both sides agreed on of primate cities, it's pouring in all your resources from the government to one city. It is not we're not talking about the difference between these secondary primate cities. Also, I would like to point out that there's a difference between a capital and a primate city. You can still have a capital without having a primate city. There's a very big difference here. Like Sacramento is a capital. It's not a primate city. There's a very big difference there. And we are saying that primate cities should be discouraged, not having capitals. So what we're saying is we are able to give resources to maybe 5 cities and see shared outcomes and shared benefits. We don't need to pour it all into one city. And then they really try to go home on this point that we never gave you warranting for why a primate city should exist. We tell you we do. There's literally examples in the info slide. Jakarta, Lima, all of these nations that exist are primate cities, meaning that they do exist in the current world. And we did talk about how they are actually collapsing. And the fact is, we can literally continue with that. There was unrefuted evidence that still stands. The fact that in 2011, when Bangkok flooded, which accounts for 40% of Thailand's economy, 7.7 of the national GDP was lost. And then even right now, Jakarta, it's sinking today, and there's a $35 billion project to move this primate city to another area because of the over-reliance on it. We've given examples of how these primate cities are not working, and there was no actual real-world example from their side. They give you a bunch of this hypothetical analysis, but there was nothing. They dropped every single piece of evidence we gave you, every single example. Nothing was directly responded to except for hypotheticals, and we tell you that those hypotheticals do not work. Logically speaking, once again, if you have 5 cookies, you give 1 to each kid, they're going to be good, they're going to be happy, they're going to be full, rather than giving 5 kids to 1 person. And even within one city, you're only going to see a certain amount of jobs created. It's not like by having a primate city, you're going to have unlimited jobs, unlimited resources, unlimited education. There's still a limited amount, but now we see all of these billions and billions of people coming in, causing overpopulation. The same thing goes to tourism. Their entire point about all of these people coming in, being able to travel cheaper flights. First of all, I believe they dropped the point about cheaper flights, but I would also like to talk about, they talk about a lot about the importance of tourism, about having centralized education. If we have education only in one city, what does it mean for all the other rural areas, judges? And then also, we talk about ecotourism, other than completely unrefuted, and we also talk about the fact that when we have all of this tourism that we're quoting to one area, it hurts the economy of other smaller governments, and you're not able to actually see any benefits because of the overpopulation and the fact that they don't have enough resources to support all of these incoming tourists. Because remember, these are developing nations, not developed. Tourism in these developing nations is different than what we see here in America. It's not the same thing. We are talking here about equitable development, judges. Remember at the very beginning what our value criterion was. Equitable development to help the most amount of people. That's only possible when we discourage primate cities. Once again, it's not like we're banning them, they'll still exist, but we don't think that they should proliferate. We don't think there should be more of them, especially because, another example that went unrefuted, the entire valley in Peru where 1/3 of the population lives, Lima, another primate city that's at risk of their entire population dying. Judges, in the end, we tell you it is very, very important that you vote for the government today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for judging, by the way, and thank you for recording.
It's going to be quite a recording, I don't
okay.
want to watch it back.
We can edit the hallway. Edit that out.
Edit the part where I have to repent across the whole place.
Oh no, we're keeping that in.
Oh, really?
Take like 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes
5 minutes what?
to judge.
Okay, so here's how it's going to work. The judges have worked out, well, Dave and I have to work out which order, but you let me know what you prefer, David. So let me tell you the result and avoid the drama. Harriton, congratulations. You won by the skin of your teeth. It was a 2-1. It was a superb debate. I'll have more to say on that, but bravo. Really, it's a really great debate. Topic was not an easy topic, and we'll talk more about it in a minute. The vote was 2-1. Muni, who's in front of you, voted for government, so we thought it would be useful to have Muni go first, and then David and I can figure out who'll go after that on comments. But I do want to all of you to encourage, if we have the time, if you have any questions, you want to interact with us, we don't melt, fire away. Okay?
For sure.
Alright, so I'll keep it brief. I think you already know who won the debate. So in my point of view, the Gov side overall had better arguments in terms of supporting their case, and that's why I voted for the Gov side. And the reasons are, if I look for supporting a case in terms of inequality, for example, one of the things which was coming up in the debate was if you are not supporting, or if you are supporting the primate cities, then you are not supporting the other rural communities or secondary cities or developing your country in other places. And that from the opposite, you are basically saying that okay, putting all the resources in one place is in the centralized economy sort of model is essentially more effective. But that was not convincing enough for me, so I voted for Gov because Gov essentially said that, and there are different topics you covered about tourism, economic development, education, construction, the farming, and the supply of raw materials from rural or secondary cities to the primary cities. All those things also contribute to the development of the economy in other places. So for me, that argument won over the centralized economic part of it. So that's why I voted for the government side. So with that, I will hand it over to
Flip a coin, you have a preference?
I'll go.
Okay.
I voted off just on the overall benefits of encouraging a centralized location on levels of education, commerce, government. Gov provides examples where we do have primate cities who struggle, particularly Bangkok, but I would have loved to have seen you extend the impacts of that in the long run. How was it that they were not able to come back as a result of all of that being focused in on Bangkok, particularly in that run? Where I think OPT does extend maintaining a centralized location, that prosperity and those international relationships can drive, and then they also can help manage and mitigate those might moments when a disaster could in fact happen. I think OPT also won the corruption point as far as the dispersion of funds, which Gov doesn't really ever address. Gov does raise a valid point about the dispersion of resources in the other area. However, I think OPT does a good job in responding with on how primate cities helps achieve more wealth and innovation, which then gets dispersed. Both the surrounding areas through that infrastructure, along with the support of the primate city, particularly construction and building materials, agriculture. I think OPT outweighs poverty and migration with opportunity and more easily managed regulation and development, which again contributes to better capital, which then contributes to that concept of a developed nation that can thrive. In the end, there's that question of, you brought up capital versus a primate city and everything. Yeah, Sacramento's we're in a fully developed nation where we can have all those resources and everything else. Within a developing situation, that centralized control, I think I buy OPT's approach in that it really needs to be there for oversight as well as to create more capital, which will help the country even further. But great job, everybody.
Thank you.
Reason for decision is a little more complicated because I really struggled with this and was the last one to get my vote in. And the reason it was hard is because you all did such a great job. You each side had some really strong arguments. You each had some quite measurable winners and some good evidence in argument as well. For example, you all had the government The example of Rwanda was excellent and was never really touched, never really rebutted. I mean, if I'm you, I'm probably saying, why wasn't that good enough to win the debate? It was excellent. Your arguments about undermining national resilience were excellent arguments. They didn't beat you. You won that argument. So you're probably saying, why'd you vote against me? And I think that what I found was, I think Ms. Norman framed the issue well. I wrote on my flow during their speech and before your rebuttal speech, I said, where do we start the analysis? Do we start the analysis with one already primate city, or do we start the analysis with a developing country which is saying, how is the best way to go about developing our situation? And in some ways, I don't want to say I bought entirely your further comment, but it did cause me pause when you said, hey, wait a minute, they can't co-opt the impacts because they shouldn't have a primate city under the topical analysis. So if this is sounding like I voted on topicality, I didn't. I think you were within the fair means of the topic, and I think you scored some pretty strong points. Where I think I weighed and came along, I think, along the thinking that David also had, was I felt like, well, I frankly personally disagree on the corruption argument totally, because I think that when you concentrate the way you do, you create Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos type situations, right? Or you create the problems in Nigeria, my God, with the leaders controlling the oil companies. But you guys didn't rebut on that. I can't base my argument on what I think or something I might know from later on. Also, I thought the negative argument on human capital was very powerful, and I probably tended to lean a little bit more toward their formulation of the topic and their world, which is to say, I thought this topic was saying, starting blank slate, what's the best development strategy? So I tended to probably discount a little bit, even though you won the argument clearly and powerfully with excellent examples. I probably discounted the national resilience argument. And I thought that the point that I think one of the NAICs, maybe both of you, that you can have your education center in the big, huge city, but the whole idea is you then send them back to the countryside. I mean, if you think about it, wasn't in this debate, but I'm just sharing with you. I didn't use this as a basis for decision, but I'm just saying, think about a place like Kenya, Nairobi. There's all kinds of education and NGOs that are in Nairobi, and they're teaching them how to farm, and they're sending people back to other places. And that's going on in many parts of Africa. But again, that specific point wasn't part of my decision. But you did argue, hey, what's the problem? They're trained, send them back to the countryside and build the education that way. So I felt that you guys did a somewhat better job, really close, of explaining how to economically develop from the top down versus you all trying to explain how you were going to get the country to the best place from the bottom up. And I sort of sensed that you needed to take the risk on national resilience if you were going to get this economic engine moving. And I thought they would get the economic engine moving sooner than you all would in your world. Excellent debate. This was really close. I struggled.
Thank you so much, guys. You guys did really well.
And for the runner-up team.